density that exists in the United States is copper, cobalt, lithium, and nickel. And even though there are multiple energy sources that require these minerals, EVs and battery storage are projected to account for about half of the mineral demand growth in the next 2 decades. So in light of this reality and the collective advocacy that we have been engaged with as IPL and climate activists, the question that is really alive for us in the West, where mining is ramping up, is what are ways we can morally and ethically approach the need to move away from fossil fuel extraction and mitigate the impacts of increasing extraction of these transitional minerals. We don't want to trade one harmful extractive industry for another, and this is of particular concern to us because of mining law in the United States, both historically and presently. So you might have heard of the 1872 mining law and why it's pretty bad and outdated. So here are just a few kind of top level reasons, and our folks will go more into this. But the 1872 mining law governs hard rock mining on 350 million acres of federal public lands, largely in the West and Alaska. And mining interests can mine taxpayer-owned minerals without paying any royalties, unlike other extractive industries. So there's no tax benefit to the public. Mining consistently trumps other land use claims, including recreation, conservation, tribal claims to sacred sites, renewable energy, and sometimes even fossil fuel extraction. The 1872 mining law historically has loose and inconsistent environmental regulations, and we know that mining leaves an enormous legacy of toxic waste, which is of course impactful to local communities, as well as a burden on taxpayers for cleanup. And if we step back and look at the big picture of this law and its impact historically, it was a crucial element in inspiring and justifying settler colonial expansion west and the subsequent dispossession and genocide of Indigenous peoples. So it's clear that this law needs to be reckoned with and reformed, and we'll be hearing more about that from panelists, as well as sharing a resource so that you can delve into more details of the law if you're interested. And the last thing I just want to bring to light as a framing is the real-time relevance of the boom in mining operations for transitional minerals in the United States. So one example, at the beginning of this year, the first large-scale lithium extraction plant in the US began construction in California's Salton Sea. Additionally, there's a proposal for the Tamarack mining project in central Minnesota, which would only be the second nickel mine in the United States. It's projected to begin operations in 2026 and is already quite contentious among community members, particularly the Ojibwe tribe, who are especially concerned about water contamination. And then the closest to home of these examples for Arizona and New Mexico is the Resolution copper mine that Apache Stronghold is contesting at the United States Supreme Court as we speak. This would be the largest copper mine in the US, and its footprint includes Oak Flat, which is sacred land to the San Carlos Apache tribe. And there are plenty of other operations I could have uplifted, but this is just a snapshot of the landscape we are already living inside of. And it's why the Western state affiliates have been feeling increasing urgency to wrap our heads and our hearts around this issue, around mining reform, and the deep questions of faith and morality they carry, especially in light of historical harm it is created for land and the people who call that land home and sacred. So without any further ado, I will introduce our wonderful panelists, and I'm going to introduce them in reverse order so that we can segue right into our first panelist. So tonight we are going to be hearing, and maybe you can take yourself off, or put yourself on camera for this. We're going to be hearing from Marianne Comfort tonight. Marianne is Justice Coordinator for Earth, Anti-Racism, and Women for the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas. She also coordinates the Interreligious Working Group on Extractive Industries, which is providing education and advocacy opportunities on mining and the energy transition. Marianne, we're very grateful to have your knowledge with us tonight. And then we're also going to be hearing from Eiley McIvers. Eiley is Interfaith Power and Light's Clean Transportation Organizer and works to mobilize people of faith across the country in the fight for clean transportation. She is especially passionate about the intersection between climate change and racial, gender, and economic justice. Eiley joins IPL after graduating summa cum laude from the University of Houston with a BA in political science and minors in energy and sustainability, music literature, and women's studies. 3 minors is quite impressive, Eiley. We're glad to have you here. And first, we're going to be hearing from Pat Gonzalez-Rogers, who wears many hats. Among them, he is a distinguished practitioner in residence at the Yale Center for Environmental Justice and serves on the board of the America the Beautiful for All Coalition, which is an initiative of the Biden and Harris administration. Pat was the executive director of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition for 4 years, and prior to that, he was the senior tribal policy advisor at the EPA. Pat has worked in many capacities in tribal and US federal government on consulting, and I could go on, but I can just say that we lay claim to him here in New Mexico because he's a graduate of the University of New Mexico School of Law. I had the honor of having Pat as a professor at Yale School of the Environment, and I'm so glad that we get to hear from your depth of expertise and also your humor tonight. So Pat, go ahead and take it away. Thank you.
Fa'afetai telelafa alofa afil in my own indigenous tongue, Samoan. I always kind of want to start because I work not exclusively, but primarily within Native American communities that I'm not Native American. And I also want to make acknowledgement to my own kinds of cultures. So what I said was thank you, welcome, and hello. And so, you know, I'll just start off the conversation by saying is that we're in a really kind of unique, but in many ways, a fairly consistent kind of environment relative to our Native communities juxtaposed against the greater interest specifically to the environment and extraction that we have historically faced. So what do I mean by that? Well, when one considers that 99% of public lands are west of the Mississippi, tribes, including Alaskan Natives, occupy 100 million acres, which is about 1/6 of all public lands. And so practically speaking, what this really means is invariably, because so much of our construct to the apparatus of extraction is on public lands, it means tribal communities are directly affected. And so this really then magnifies the problem. Tribes, as many of you know, are not really ethnic or racial kind of identifications. What they are at the end of the day are political sovereigns, specifically domestic sovereigns. And so they are really juxtaposed against the framework of federal and state interests, but in many ways they are subordinated in this trust relationship to the federal government. And so historically, this has meant while in a typical trust relationship, and what I mean by that is the United States serves as a fiduciary to Indian country, is that they would have the best interests of tribal and Native communities. But too often what we have seen is this is a relationship of convenience, one that really affords the benefit to both the dominant class and the status quo. And so to give you a specific example, and some of you might know this, there are recent kinds of dynamics and events like land back in which tribes go out and intentionally try to get and obtain ancestral lands. And in many ways, it has been a kind of a contemporary success. What many don't know is in almost every instance of a tribe obtaining either lands that were ceded or in other ownership, subsurface rights do not attach to that fee simple ownership. So that's a bunch of kind of legal goobity gook. But let's just say a tribe buys an adjacent land and it's 10,000 acres, and they do this through, some dynamic with like the Trust for Public Lands. When that land is transferred, the tribe owns the surface. All subsurface extraction remains within the ownership primarily of the federal government, and in sometimes a private interest. So think about this. Even when they have the ability and resources to reobtain their lands, those extraction rights are never then given back. They remain in the interest of the federal government and private interests. And so this is too often the case in something in the greater benefit of the country and probably done with prudence and benevolence. We're trying to, really obtain and reach the next iteration of our nation in a green economy. But too often that is done on the basis and the backs of Native communities. And I kind of concentrate on Native communities, but I would say the larger BIPOC community, because what we know is in many instances, those communities suffer the brunt of many of these activities. And so while we have these kinds of constructs set up within the federal government to really kind of flesh out the opinions of Native communities, which is called the federal trust responsibility through consultation, too often, I think these are like optical kinds of exercise that are almost performative and perfunctory relative to the interests of tribes. We're seeing this now in like southern and central Nevada relative to lithium interests, because when we talk about things like critical or rare elements, about 2/3 of this is within Indian country. So again, juxtaposed against the need of the country, the rights of tribes, but it's all based in the tribes' backyards. And so at least what I've found through my kind of experience and career is it goes on swimmingly for like 95% of the time. It's that 5% of the time when it's actually means something to the tribes that the federal government say, oh, we have a prevailing or a compelling interest. And these are not statutory or codified terms. These are terms that they just kind of place on tribes when they think their interests are greater. And so what I'm saying is there's not a great consistency to when it really counts. Now, we do have a mechanism, and it's something that, I discussed in the class with Clara, is co-management. And so, briefly kind of speaking, is co-management is the ability of tribes to be part of the decision-making, right? As well as sharing the resources and assets relative to executive management, not like just retail management, but the bigger decisions to these kinds of decisions regarding the landscape. And why I bring that up is, one, that is the model of the Bears Ears. And so I have some kind of experience and nuance that tells me that it's a very practical solution, but it's a very profound force multiplier. And I'll kind of briefly summarize why. One, it reinforces tribal sovereignty. Two, it really implements traditional and native practice towards conservation in the environment. Three, it really then affords Native communities to practice their own spirituality and theology. And the fourth and final point, it is real-time restorative justice. It allows the tribes, who are the original stewards, to be in the place of real decision-making on the lands that they in many instances have been in from time immemorial. And so I advance that kind of thought for us to kind of think about this and allow other speakers to kind of weigh in from their own perspectives. But I approach this as kind of my experience about the legal framework as well as the public policy, that we really kind of frame these issues with tribes. But at the end of the day, what consistently has been shown is if the US has a really large and compelling interest, they'll subordinate the tribal interest despite this legal framework. And so those are something to kind of, start off our conversation.
Thank you so much, Pat. That is great stuff to think about, and we will have time at the end for Q&A if people want to follow up on those thoughts. Next, we have Eiley presenting, and Eiley, I will share my screen here.
Thanks, Clara.
Tell me when to switch.
All right. Well, firstly, I just want to start off and say thank you so much to Clara and Melanie and Joan and everyone at all of the Western State IPL affiliates for doing the hard work of organizing this webinar. I'm really grateful and honored to be here with y'all tonight. So thank you so much for your work. My name is Eiley McKeevers, and I work as the Clean Transportation Organizer at the National Office of Interfaith Power and Light. And I want to begin this with a little bit of talk about electric vehicles, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about minerals, and then we're going to tie it together at the end. So if Clara, you could advance us to the next slide. Thank you. So as people of faith and conscience, we are called, or we feel called, to transition away from polluting and destructive fossil fuels. And I want to start this out by asking the question, why are EVs important? And I want to call attention to the fact that right now, transportation is the #1 source of climate pollution in the US. And unlike a lot of other sectors, transportation's climate pollution is still growing. It hasn't hit the hump yet where it, then declines. It's still currently growing. And in 2017, approximately 87% of passenger trips in the US were taken by car. I also want to note that we already have significant infrastructure for EV adoption in place, and more is coming online all the time with investments from the IIJA and the IRA. I think we can move to the next slide. So transitioning to 100% electric vehicles is absolutely a crucial step in decarbonizing the global transportation sector, but it has to be done in a way that builds a fossil-free supply chain and supports human, labor, and Indigenous rights. And while mining for critical minerals is absolutely problematic, drilling for oil and gas poses a lot of the same risks, and I want everyone to keep that in mind, in addition to creating an ongoing need for carbon-intensive oil. I also want to note that when we talk about electric vehicles, your first thought may be passenger vehicles like cars, SUVs, and pickup trucks that you see on the road, which that is absolutely true. We are talking about those vehicles, but we're also talking about other vehicles too. We're talking about school buses, we're talking about public transit buses, we're often talking about box trucks, and just the other vehicles. You might be thinking about, well, how am I going to get to the store? But we're also asking the question, how did the things in the store get there in the first place? So one of the crucial solutions, and now we're going to move into a little bit about talking of how we can move forward in this electric transformation and this transition while supporting this just and equitable supply chain. So I think we can move to this is just a little photo of a cobalt mine, just for a little visual of what mining actually looks like in the world. So probably our most important solution here is called FPIC, or Free, Prior, and Informed Consent. So IPL advocates for the industry-wide establishment of FPIC. And I want to note that in this case, when I say industry-wide, I'm talking about the auto industry. Of course, it should absolutely be in place for the mining industry, but as someone who works on cars and other vehicles, I'm specifically referring to the auto industry, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So according to the UN, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples requires states to consult and cooperate in good faith with Indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing mineral extraction sites that might affect them. So free, prior, and informed consent is widely supported by international organizations, Indigenous-led environmental networks, and climate advocacy organizations around the world. FPIC exists in order to establish grassroots community engagement and consultation of Indigenous groups with the possibility of giving or withholding consent, which is a critical piece of this that has frequently been lacking, especially in the United States. So I think we can move to the next slide. Thank you. Another thing is we advocate here at IPL for more efficient vehicles. And this is more on the side of passenger vehicles. And when I say efficient, I mean smaller. This means less pickup trucks, less SUVs. Those vehicles are really heavy and they require heavy, large batteries to power them. Smaller vehicles need smaller batteries, less mineral usage, and that also makes them more affordable. Another thing that we advocate for is battery mineral recycling. So the good thing about mineral recycling is that minerals are inherently valuable and they can be reused indefinitely with some degradation of mineral quality over time. So according to the NRDC, a newer recycling process called hydrometallurgical recycling begins with mechanical sorting and crushing like typical recycling, but it recovers battery minerals by using acids to produce solvents containing the materials. And these minerals, including lithium, which is a common battery mineral, are then recovered from the solution at rates of 95% on average, which is pretty incredible when you think about recycling as a whole. That makes this kind of recycling really efficient. The next thing that I want to discuss a little bit that I think often goes overlooked because it may not be in the news or have as much visibility, but it's the development of alternative battery chemistries. So there's actually significant research being conducted all the time about different battery types that reduce or eliminate the need for certain minerals like cobalt, because cobalt is often linked to child labor in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo. So these alternatives include lithium iron phosphate batteries or LFP batteries, and those don't require nickel or cobalt, and they have increased thermal and chemical stability. There's also sodium ion batteries, which have lower energy density, but they're much less affected by low temperatures, which is a common concern we see about EVs. And they also appear to be able to handle more charge and discharge cycles than lithium ion batteries. So there are these developments happening all the time, and it's really in the hands of automakers to bring these new and efficient battery technologies to market. Another thing that's really crucial is supply chain transparency. So this includes, but is not limited to, things like battery passports. So again, according to the NRDC, battery labeling in general is a crucial early step in battery regulations because standardized labels make sure that actors throughout the supply chain can access the information that they need. And that might sound a little silly, like who would make a battery without a label, but it's clearly still an issue. Battery labels convey information about the battery's materials, chemistry, design, their operational capabilities, and their health. And that makes sure that the people who need to know the information about the battery get that information. And that way they're able to be reused, downcycled, recycled in the appropriate manner. We also have battery passports kind of in this category. So battery passports will be mandatory for electric vehicles sold in the European Union from February 2027, showing the composition of batteries. And this will include the origin of key materials, their carbon footprint, and recycled content. And this is also important because it makes sure and it holds automakers to account about where they're getting their minerals from. So now we're getting into automaker leverage, and this is really kind of my specialty. Because automakers are such major consumers of energy transition minerals, they have significant power over the development and implementation of more equitable and more sustainable supply chains. And we advocate for those automakers, especially those who are heavily investing in electric vehicles, to use their purchasing power as leverage for more sustainably produced minerals, and also calls on automakers to commit to protecting Indigenous rights by instating FPIC. Right now, there are no automakers, literally zero, that have fully institutionalized FPIC into their code of conduct. So that's something that's really important to us. We also call on automakers and battery producers to accept end-of-life battery responsibility so that that burden doesn't fall on the shoulders of consumers who may not know what to do with spent batteries. And that also helps ensure effective recycling and or repurposing. So to wrap this all up, the establishment of this new global EV supply chain is in a lot of ways a really exciting opportunity. And it's an opportunity to build an equitable, just, and more sustainable supply chain from the ground up. And it's our moral opportunity to do it right the first time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eily. We really appreciate all of your work and advocacy. And yeah, please go ahead and keep putting your questions in the Q&A box on the bottom part of the screen. And now I am excited to turn it over to Mary Ann. So let me pull up your PowerPoint.
Thank you so much, Clara, and thank you, Eily, for all your work and for sharing with us. So I'm going to talk about how do we look at this from an advocacy with our government. Eily was talking a little bit about the leverage with automakers, but how do we engage with our government, which would mostly be the federal, but in some instances there might be state decisions being made around extraction. So there is a lot of conversation in Congress about this issue. Critical minerals is really a hot topic in Congress, and everyone's racing to pass bills to make sure that we have the supply of these minerals. And it's often couched in trying to make sure we're not dependent on China, that we're competitive with China. So lots of action in Congress. So those of us from the faith community, and this includes Eily, she was part of these conversations, we decided we really needed to come up, what would be faith principles? How do we look at legislation from a faith perspective? So we came up with a document that we can use in our meetings with legislators on these topics, and also that we can use in educating our networks. And I'll put in the chat the actual document, but these are the four, kind of the top line principles we're talking about. Eily talked about FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. So engaging communities in decision making. How do we have the strongest possible consultation standards that we are going to be engaging communities, which are often Native communities, because there's a huge percentage of these minerals are on or close to Native land, both in the US and around the world. The other thing, of course, is how do we have the strongest and possible labor, environmental, and human rights standards? If we're going to be mining, how do we make sure that we're doing it in the best way possible? And then Eily was talking about recycling and reuse. So how do we make sure that our federal government, which has all kinds of funding for research and development, that they are looking at having technologies so that we don't even have to mine so much to begin with. Everyone's assuming that we're going to have to do all this mining for minerals, but can we develop technologies to minimize the need for new mining? And then also, as Eiley said, we're when we're looking at legislation, can we ensure transparency in the mineral supply chain? And that includes, do we know where these minerals are going to? Because the term critical minerals is now also starting to be used for minerals that will be used for the military. So can we be sure that when we're talking about doing all this mining, that it really is going to what we would see as positive use in developing renewable energy and not to armaments and military uses. So that would be another part of that area. So if we can go to the next slide. So what is actual concrete legislation out there that might do some of what we're hoping to do? One of them is the Clean Energy Minerals Reform Act. It is now in its second introduction. It was introduced in the last Congress. It is now in the current Congress, and hopefully will come up in the next Congress as well. And this is a way to how can we improve that 1872 mining law that Clara was talking about? I mean, just think about it. In 1872, they were using pickaxes to get gold. And now we're blowing up mountains and we're having huge open pit mines. And we really need to update this law for those new technologies. So one of the things is to modernize mining planning. Rather than assuming that mining for hard rock minerals is the best use of public land, let's make mining has to go through the same planning processes as any other kind of use of public land. Right now, hard rock mining companies don't pay to have operations on public land. So let's make sure taxpayers get some benefit, have some kind of a royalty structure. Make sure they pay for the cleanup. Make sure that we're actually remediating the land and having really adequate cleanup of the abandoned mines. Again, it has environmental standards for mining, requires meaningful tribal consultation. And this one I think is really critical. It allows federal agencies to say that some public land shouldn't be used for mining at all because there's really there's sensitive environmental issues there, or it's sacred land to Native people. So giving federal agencies that opportunity to remove public land from consideration. So this is a bill we'd really support and urge people to support. And then we'll go to a bill that we're really hoping that people will oppose. And this is, we can go to the next slide, Clara. This is the Mining Regulatory Clarity Act. And this is actually passed out of committee in the Senate. So this actually has quite some momentum behind it. And this is all, the people who are supporting this law say it's necessary because of a court decision that said, well, the 1872 mining law says the mining companies can only claim land for mining if they can prove that there's actually valuable minerals under it. And so this court decision said, we're going to uphold this. And all the mining companies said, oh my gosh, we can't operate if you require that because we need to have land also to dump the waste and have pipelines and have some of our infrastructure. So this bill is kind of like on steroids trying to address this conundrum that the mining companies say they have. So companies can actually claim public land for mining, even if there is no evidence of valuable minerals. They have the absolute right to this land in perpetuity, where they can use it for mining waste, they can use it for pipelines, what have you. And one particular thing that groups are really concerned about is it could open the door to nuisance claims. You don't even have to be a mining company. You could be somebody who just wants to stop, solar panels being put on public land, or wants to stop, transmission lines. And so you could claim, I stake a claim, this is a mineral claim, and now I have claimed this, and I'm not going to let any of these technologies come in. Or I could extort the federal government. I could say, I'm going to charge you, federal government, lots of money if you want to use this for other purposes. So there's a lot of concerns that environmental groups have around this. So Clean Energy Mineral Reform Act, yay. Mining Regulatory Clarity Act, very concerned about, hoping that will not move forward. So that's my very quick and overview of legislative landscape here, and happy to answer questions once we get to that point.
Thank you so much, Marianne. You've all given us, I think, a lot to consider, and I see that there are a few questions in the chat already, so I will go ahead and frame some of those for you all. One question is, with battery production and mineral mining issues, is it possible to have truly clean transportation? And these questions are open to all of them.
Yeah, I'll take a first stab at this one, and I welcome Pat or Marianne to share their thoughts as well. This is a great question, and it's difficult to answer because on some level, 100% clean transportation would be extremely difficult to achieve. And I do want to acknowledge that the cleanest mode of transportation is likely attached to your body in the form of your legs. But the way that our country, our states, our cities, and our communities have been developed does not promote walking or biking, which are some of the cleanest forms of transportation, as truly feasible. So within these guidelines of this world that we've created, it does seem like 100% clean transportation is out of reach. I would caution us to not let that hold us back from striving for better transportation now. And also noting that there are other different factors in transportation other than just making cars. Again, investing in public transportation, different kinds of zoning laws that allow for walkable communities, et cetera, et cetera. But again, I would just really focus on the fact that we do feel called to strive for a better system than the one that's currently locking us into potential decades of pollution.
So I was going to add, and this is just kind of a clarify on some previous points. So FPIC, full, prior, and informed consent, is not the standard in the US. It is a part of an international framework drawn from the DRIP, the Declaration of Right of Indigenous Peoples. And so tribes are subordinated to the federal government. And so we have consultation, which is really in some ways the counter to FPIC, because it's not informed consent. It means to consult. And that is why I made this delineation to co-management. Our previous models are much more analogous with tribes to what I called collaborative or shared decision making, right? And that is really what tribes are kind of engaged in. They provide a perspective, but their federal government does not require sign off from tribes. And in fact, in the international community, FPIC in many instances is not done. And it's because there is really spotty kind of enforcement. It's a separate discussion, but I think more thought has to be paid attention from the capitalization of international projects via the World Bank, but you could tie in enforcement through dollars given through the World Bank to these projects. But again, I think that's a separate discussion. And then finally, I would say relative to extraction, part of the problem is so much of it is on public lands, and the public lands framework, at least in its previous iteration, has a definite slant towards extraction, because one must realize when many of these public lands were created, we were in the kind of expansion of the US, and we wanted in a intentional way and define to exploit these resources so that we could expand the Western US. And what that means is people get, in a very speculative way, extraction leases on public lands for pennies on the dollars. And so I think one of the ways to approach it is to make it more cost prohibitive. And this is not just in the current iteration of a green economy. The Southwest is just littered with hundreds, if not tens of thousands of uncapped wells because it's so cheap, and then people get into this speculative posture. And what people don't realize, it's not, Unical or British Petroleum. It's like 2 or 3 person, what we would call wildcat outfitters that are doing this. And so if there is no kind of oil or gas, they just leave it. And this goes true for other things. And so if we were to rise the price point of people looking at these kinds of public land contracts to extract, we could probably eliminate many of the non-serious kinds of people, but also ameliorate the activities as well. So I'll kind of leave it at that.
Thank you. Marianne, did you have anything you want to say to this question?
Nope, we can go on.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of questions were sort of addressed in the chat, and I welcome any of our other organizers to answer or to ask any questions you have. I have a question for Pat about tribal co-management as a model and how you see that potentially unfolding, maybe in another case study, or maybe just more generally as a position from which to approach this sort of actual meaningful tribal consultation.
Yeah, a lot of my perspectives of this is not from an ideologically based kind of perspective. It is based on almost an abundancy of pragmatism. So when we place folks that are the original stewards, what you really get is a consistency of conservatorship over these lands and waters. And so unlike, like nonprofits, and we're talking about the largest ones like TNC and the Sierra Club, they go through a cyclical kind of campaign of the things that they support. But if one to work with tribes, the postures that they maintain right now are very well the postures they're going to have, not just in decades to come, but in future generations, 5, 6, 7 down the road. And one does not have to wonder if they're going to still be there, because in many instances they've been there from time immemorial. So that's one component. The other component is also, if you think about especially those activities that they share in responsibility with the federal government, there's a cost benefit. Instead of having the federal apparatus involved, that responsibility then is turned over to the tribes, which also means in many instances, legacy costs. And what I mean by that is the benefits retirement package of federal employees are not assumed by the federal government. Those are then, the resources are given to the tribes, but then now you have tribal employees. What does that mean? It also means that you're reinforcing local and regional economies by having tribal workforces take over these responsibilities. And so there's a lot of kind of carryover that is seamless to these activities. I forget who had asked a question on like what would happen on this. And one, I don't want to, have a monolithic answer because tribes can speak for themselves. They're individual sovereigns. But in most instances, it's safe to say they're going to be opposed to extraction activities or a much more kind of balanced portfolio relative to that. And so now you're going to have something much more in alignment to a sustainable and durable kind of activity balanced against how they preserve land and waters. And so that will really kind of instruct and influence the process as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to open up to Joan and Melanie if you have a question, and then we have another question in the chat.
I do have a question. And Pat, I so appreciated this idea of co-management, and you're talking about that, and you know, Bears Ears is certainly a groundbreaking, you know, beginning for some of that. My question, though, is because so much of this oil extraction, it takes place on public lands here in the Southwest. Is there somehow maybe a way, a creative way with this co-management to engage citizens in addressing oil and gas on public lands that is currently not tribal lands? It's just a thought that came as you were talking about the co-management model.
Well, so you touched upon something, right? And so there's this other thing that a lot of people don't realize. So there are tribes, right? And typically, so let's kind of like look at a typical scenario. You have the tribal reservation, right? And it's a delineated area. But in most instances, the lands that are adjacent to tribes are federal public lands, right? And so you both have inherently tribal lands, but these lands that are adjacent, almost in every instance, they're called ceded lands. These were lands that were part of the ancestral homeland and then ceded to the federal government, which means tribes retain rights. They're called off-reservation rights for cultural and historical preservation purposes. It means they can hunt, they can fish, they can gather wood, they can do spiritual ceremonies. But to your point, which is a very insightful and nuanced point, Joan, is all of these collective kinds of advocacies and activities are not just done within the tribal communities. The Bears Ears is successful because the tribes articulated a viewpoint and instructed the process, but they did so with the support of external communities. And so my kind of advancement and my real encouragement is to work with tribal communities from an external way to say, all right, what is your perspective and how can we assist and amplify that message? And you play a really substantive role in reinforcing this because the tribes cannot just do it by themselves. They have inherent legal rights, and that is incredibly important. But the kind of narrative that can be built upon and then, as I say, amplified from external communities relative to native ones is the thing that really then pushes it to the finish line. So I think that's a great point, and I would encourage everyone to work directly with tribes from your own things to say, how can we buttress your activities?
Thank you, Pat. I think we have time for probably one more question. Melanie, if you have one, I'll open that up to you, or I can ask what we have in the chat.
Go ahead with the questions in the chat.
All right, our last question. How much cleaner is the current production of EV vehicles relative to the current extraction and production of gasoline and oil for internal combustion vehicles?
Yeah, I think this question is likely directed toward me.
Probably.
So yes, I do want to be clear that creating an electric vehicle does more damage to the climate than creating a gas vehicle. But the tides start to turn as soon as you start driving the vehicles, which is likely why you would purchase a vehicle, would be to drive it, I think. So as soon as you start driving an electric vehicle, it will quickly surpass a gas car in terms of the gas car will surpass the electric vehicle really quickly in carbon emissions and other damage to the climate. So if you plan on buying an electric vehicle and never driving it, I would caution against that plan. But otherwise, the science is very clear. There's actually an excellent report from the ICCT, the International Council on Clean Transportation, about this very topic, about how all you need to do to make an EV better for the environment than a gas car is drive it. Also, I do want to note that we have to remember that every time you fill up a traditional gas burning vehicle, you are requiring mining. So the mining for an electric vehicle battery theoretically happens once, and the mining for your gas car happens every time you fill up your vehicle with gas.
Thank you so much, Eileen. I think we have time for one more question. This is a really good question. Does Congress need to write really good laws about recycling minerals, cleanup, and end of life? The Supreme Court took away the agency's ability to write procedures.
I guess I can start with that. I think what they might be referring to is the Chevron decision, that was kind of limiting what agencies can respond to that isn't specifically written in law. So in that response, yes, we can't, I think when you're thinking about any kind of legislation, it appears from the Supreme Court decision that Congress is going to have to be very specific in writing laws, because their agencies are not going to have the same discretion to use their technical expertise. The problem with that, of course, is that Congress, one, doesn't necessarily have the technical expertise to be able to write all the technical details into a law. And two, can you imagine all the difficulty we have now in passing legislation when it's not all that technical detail? I mean, how is Congress going to come together and pass legislation, and with all the technical details that they can be debating for years before ever passing anything? So it is a problematic situation we're in now. Yes, if Congress could write more specific laws, that would help, but politically, that would be very difficult to do.
And let me add to that what Marianne kind of insightfully framed. What it means is there is already an overabundance and reliance on lobbyists writing legislation. When you eliminate the Chevron deference, which is essentially, do you defer to subject matter experts within agencies? It then really practically then allows lobbyists to be more engaged in the articulation and the specific writing to these technical matters. And what really turns out, and this is true of both DNR administrations, the largest players have the greatest influence, right? And if those monetary and pecuniary kind of matters influence Congress, ultimately that's the last pen on the legislation. And so now we've put in our situation where we're now even more exposed to lobbyists actually writing legislation.
Thank you. Yeah. Eileen, do you want to say anything to that question?
I think it's covered.
All right. Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for being here. We're going to just go a few minutes, no more than 5, I think, over the hour tonight. I want to make sure you know that in the chat, I have shared a resource handout, which has links to both information about the 1872 mining reform, the faith principles that Marianne uplifted, Eileen's work on critical minerals and supply chain reform with IPL, as well as an action ask around some of the legislation that Marianne brought up. And it also includes sort of some instructions for how to go about contacting your legislators around that. And for our closing, I want to invite Sister Joan to offer a few remarks.
Yes, thanks, Claire, and thanks, everyone. This is such an important conversation, I think, especially to have with people of faith or people of faith and conscience and on spiritual paths, because we're not just dealing with technology, we're dealing with values and the future and what that means. And we keep saying we can't just keep recreating problems with a new technology, because climate change is not ultimately an issue of technology. It's not the technologies of oil and gas or coal or whatever it might be, but it's really the underlying social and cultural systems that created and lock people and us into these technologies through unsustainable patterns of consumption, growth, and inequity. And so I think that's what we've been grappling with tonight, and we need to continue to grapple with that in a very conscious way, because we're talking about automobiles and cars and transportation and mining and oil and gas tonight, but there are other elements that are not even on the horizon. They're in our midst right now, like AI and other uses of energy that are also touting to be technical solutions for climate change. So we need to really grapple with these questions. What is our soul purpose? What is our human purpose in being here? And how do we grapple with these, and to not shy away from that? And many organizations do not and are not grappling with these complexities. So I'd like to just leave us with a poem by Wendell Berry called "The Real Work." It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we have come to our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed.